Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. For this installment, we're discussing a commander that's been really popularly requested for the series, which I have to assume means that a lot of you out there are Les Mis fans. Marius, what's wrong today? You look as if you've Xenagos. Xenagos, god of Revels, is one of the most popular Theros gods in all of Commander, constantly jostling for the top spot with Karametra and Phoenix. He's 5 mana and maintains that only a creature if you're devoted to me ability that we all know and love from our Theros pantheon. And he sports one of the more bonkers abilities that those gods have on offer. Each combat, he doubles up and hastes up any one of our creatures, priming it for the combat step of its life. Xenagos encapsulates green and red. Smash, smash, smash. We've had years to get to know him, so his page is full of old favorites, and he certainly keeps up with the times, gaining new tramply friends like Garruk's Uprising and Quartzwood Crasher. I can't help but notice those mana dorks on his page too. Let's give our god the party he deserves by loading up his average deck list into the Architect deck building website. Remember that, as always, any swaps we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall price of the list. Big and stompy. Big and stompy and smash. We've got some creatures in this deck that hit like a truck even before Xenagos doubles their cargo and floors the gas pedal. Some of these creatures can even one-shot an opponent if they get through. It's like the truest form of Exalted. We're not assembling an army, we're just dishing out threat after threat after threat every turn, and if our opponents ever fail to remove them, then they will find themselves quickly ejected from the festivities. Even better, we have some spells here that get amplified based on the sheer power of our many behemoths. Funny enough, even though Xenagos likes parties, I don't even see any Zendikar cards that have the party mechanic here. Interesting. Truth be told, I don't have too many swaps to make to this list in its current form. Sort of. We'll actually be tackling this commander in 2 different ways. Naturally, there's the main party. Here we'll cover some good upgrades, freshen up our DJ's playlist, spice up the hors d'oeuvres, the works. But after that, there's the after party. That's right, the celebrations never stop. In this second section, I want to tackle the deck's budget a bit more in depth, because you do not need to spend a lot of money on this commander for it to rock and roll all night. That's right, there will be 2 deck lists for this episode, one for the cost neutral swaps and one for a lighter budget. Alright, guests are starting to arrive, so let's get this party started. We've picked our party theme, the decorations are in order, and the venue is set. All we have to worry about now is whether Xenagos will crank up the music so loud that it disrupts our neighbors. Let's first get acquainted with the guests we're seeing here. There are several mana dorks, which is immediately a big sign. Not all green decks opt for fast mana dorks because they're vulnerable to dying in random ways and setting us back on resources. We can tell by their presence that Xenagos wants to come down real fast and use speed as an asset to victory. Some of these creatures are insane if we double them up, too. Atarka is a double-striking bomb, while Balefire Dragon deals 12 damage in the air and will clear an enemy's board in astonishing fashion. Hydra Omnivore makes one vulnerable opponent everyone's problem. Malignus, meanwhile, can drop any opponent to 0 if it ever gets through. We also spy a fun combo here. Aggravated Assault and Ventmaw Hellkite are symbiotic to a T. Ventmaw attacks, producing mana, and we can use that mana to get additional combat steps. With each new combat step, Xenagos will trigger again and again and again, making our creatures bigger than our calculators can handle. We even see this echoed in some of our other beatstick options, from Scourge of the Throne to Port Razor to Moraug. More combat steps means more Xenagos amazingness. Port Razor in particular seems really crazy if it can hit multiple people. Therein lies the rub, though. As awesome as some of these creatures would be to hit our enemies, not all of them come with natural evasion. Some have flying, but even those can get chump blocked by a random bird token. Unblockability, or more likely trample, is one of our most important assets. There are a few cards in the list that can help us out with this: Kessig Wolfrun, Skarg the Rage Pits, the passive ability of Nylea, but it's something our deck probably needs to be more conscious of if we're looking for a proper jamboree. So, let's get started with some swaps. Almost immediately, Domri catches my eye. This pump is small, the mana production is minimal, and the card can be picked off without an enemy even breaking a sweat. I don't find Domri to help us reliably. I'd like to exchange this fella for a different 3-mana card that will help us a bit more with our trample problem. Just a simple Ferocity of the Wilds. There are surprisingly few blanket trample-granting enchantments in our colors, and some of them even cost $3 to $5 to acquire. This card is a cool 20 cents, and it's a better buff that makes our 2020s unchump blockable. The new card Exponential Growth is making its way into some Xenagos lists too, and I just don't like it here. Sorry. Xenagos makes our stuff plenty big already. We need more reliable ways to actually push the damage through rather than just getting big. I'd like to propose adding Rancor here. This thing never goes away. It is always coming back to us, ready to pump up a creature and make it impossible to block well. Combined with Xenagos, this is an extra 4 damage plus trample for 1 mana, and it never goes away for good. I love it here, and I think Xenagos will too. Speaking of which, Strionic Resonator shows up in this average deck. I feel bad about this one, but I also just don't think this is particularly great for us. It doubles up Xenagos' triggered ability, which is a great idea, in theory. We can quadruple 1 creature, for instance, or pump up 2 different ones with Xenagos' trigger. That sounds nice, but that was not my experience in practical gameplay. Once more, a quadrupled creature without a way to push the damage through is kind of a dud. And as for pumping up 2 separate creatures, that didn't tend to be my experience with this deck. Xenagos' baddies are so threatening that they tend to get removed on the spot. 1 exile spell mid-combat and they are not around to see the following turn. We dish out hit after hit, but our creatures are often expensive enough that we can kind of only deploy them 1 at a time, and defensive opponents will gear up pinpoint removal accordingly. So we rarely have that flexibility of Xenagosing 2 creatures, and instead, most often we pump up just 1 creature that will be summarily dealt with. It's a cool looking effect here, but I don't think the Strionic Resonator solves a problem that we need to solve. The problem I think we need to solve is actually card advantage. I want to swap this out for an Escape to the Wilds. Card advantage is a huge issue in this deck because a lot of our card advantage spells are dependent upon us having a big creature, and we're deploying those creatures 1 at a time, and they're at risk of being removed constantly. Hunter's Insight, for example, is amazing if we can land it, but it does nothing when we've tried to cast 3 creatures and they've each been hit with different removal on sight. Escape to the Wilds is a bit more like a Harmonize. It doesn't require us to have stuff in play, and it'll catch us up when we need a boost to help keep the onslaught coming. Don't be shy about adding more card draw to this deck in however many forms you feel you need it. An aggro deck that runs out of cards means our enemies will take over. But if we keep the hand stocked and keep the pressure on, then our opponents will be the ones who run out of options. Now, on the subject of those draw spells, several of these cards can draw so many cards that we'll have an overflowing hand. I don't want to discard any of those in the event that we draw them, so let's real quick just change that there Gruul Signet over to a Thought Vessel. They're still moderately cheap from Commander Legends, so get these before they go back up. I'm going to make a brief pit stop at the mana base before continuing to the final cuts in this section. One of our worst nightmares is a Maze of Ith effect. 1 big bad means nothing against a perpetually fogged combat step. I'm going to toss out some less important lands for some very important lands indeed. Tech Edge and Ghost Quarter. They will take out any pesky defensive lands. And I also think that we could use a Scavenger Grounds here to help keep graveyard players in check too. Alright, now to the slightly awkward parts. There are 3 classic Gruul cards that I'm gonna end up cutting here, and I think I might need to tackle them all at once to get my thoughts across correctly. Spellbreaker Behemoth, Rhythm of the Wilds, and Mage Slayer. Now hear me out. These cuts may be informed by my own personal metas, so take them with a grain of salt, but there is a method to my madness here. Starting with the first 2, Spellbreaker is among the tiniest of our pumpable creatures. Its true purpose is to keep our creatures uncounterable, and this is where I start to wonder if it's just my meta, but countering creature spells is not a common occurrence in my experience. I see players much more likely to counter the odd Wrath of God, Cyclonic Rift, Finales of Devastation, and spot removal spells, but not often countering individual creature spells. And maybe this is just the necromancer in me, but our creatures look really expendable to me. We have so many cool beasts to glow up that I don't think we'll be remiss if one of them gets countered any more than if one of them get hit with a removal spell. This is also why I feel it was fine to cut the Rhythm and the Domri from earlier. Rhythm gives us a tiny buff, and that's kind of all. Our creatures are already big enough, and Xenagos is going to give them haste on his own, so we'll be alright without it. Again, this might be a meta call. If there are a lot more counterspells running around in your metas, then these are probably much more worth it. But in the games that you play, pay attention to where counterspells get pointed, because these cards might be included to help negate a thing that isn't necessarily going to happen all of the time, and that will be okay to push through anyhow, because we've constantly got huge creatures coming every turn. Then there's the Mage Slayer. The very first thing I want to point out about this card is that I don't appear to be alone in cutting it from Xenagos decks. Over the years, its numbers on Xenagos' page have slid down from signature card to now just about 30%. It's less popular in this deck than Gruul Signet. Not only that, but when you use the advanced filters on EDHREC to view Xenagos decks that contain more optimized cards, Mage Slayer's numbers also dwindle down to only like 15%. Look, this is not a bad card. It would not be here if that was the case. This card is a means of getting damage through, even despite chump blockers or mazes of if. It can be really effective in that role. I just don't personally like that it's 3 mana to equip. That's a lot, actually. Our creatures are big to play, and attaching this card might more often be a we have to do it next turn situation. And it's all to amplify their damage output in a cool way. But if the function of the card is to amplify damage output, I just happen to think that we have other ways of doing that already, and that the cards we've added make that ability a little bit less crucial by mitigating against situations where this effect is the only way that we can push through damage because of chump blockers or mazes of ith. And ultimately, I don't think we need to drop $6 on this version of that effect, and that our money might be better served elsewhere. So after all of that, what am I proposing to replace it with? The first one I'm including because 35 lands in the deck makes me a smidge nervous. Kazul's Fury. Most of the time this might just be a tapped land for us, but some of the time it might throw a 20/20 at some unsuspecting someone. For every one of our plans in this deck, our opponents most likely is already going to see it coming because so many of our cards are just on the board abilities. This is a cool trick with just enough surprise to potentially win us the game out of nowhere, and it even helps out our mana while we're at it. The creature I cut is being replaced by something that I hope makes Craig Blanchett proud, Phyrexian Hydra. It is a 7/7 that our commander will turn into a 14/14, with haste. Some folks don't like Infect, but honestly, I just think of this like another Malignus. Both are 5-drops that our deck can provide with a little extra evasion to turn into very troublingly lethal creatures. As for the final edition, this card made me so happy when I found it. If you don't know Dense Foliage already, I highly recommend it here. Creatures can't be the targets of spells. That doesn't give them Shroud, it just means that people cannot point spells at creatures. Like removal spells. One of our biggest concerns in this deck is trying to make sure that our creatures stick around to actually hit people, and this less than $1 enchantment makes that a lot easier for us to accomplish. Importantly, cards like our Rishkar's Expertise or Return to the Wild Speaker don't even target our creatures, so we still get to play with those magnificent cards just fine. Now, admittedly, 2 cards in our deck do work against this enchantment. Hunter's Insight becomes uncastable, and Chandra's Ignition wouldn't work either. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm personally okay with that. Dense Foliage turns off 2 cards from our deck, but it shuts down way more from our enemies, tipping the scales way in our favor. In a world without pinpoint removal spells, our Towering Titans will dominate. And this here is our final list. I have some honorable mentions for just a small handful of cards that might make some waves if you're not worried about a budget cap, but we'll get to those later, because this party right here is settling down. And now we have an after party to attend. Let's move to part 2, where we slim down the budget. Our events do not need to be a black tie affair. Xenagos' original average decklist contained some expensive goodies, but we don't need to have a decadent party to have an awesome one. Xenagos is straightforward as heck. I've actually often heard him referred to as the ideal beginner's commander because the play pattern is really uncomplicated but also really impactful, and that can be accomplished without a bunch of fancy cards too. The original deck contains some expensive toys, but Xenagos' parties do not need to be decadent to be awesome. I've said it before and I'll say it again. When you see a high price tag on a deck, pay attention to where all that money is concentrated. The Great Henge and Sylvan Library combine to nearly $100 of this $400 deck. And it doesn't stop there. Balefire Dragon is another. Altogether, the swaps I'm going to make in this section will save over $200. Let's get to it. A lot of the biggest costs in the deck come from the card advantage spells. Great Henge and Sylvan Library are bonkers expensive. There's also Rishkar's Expertise and Guardian Project, which keep climbing up and up and up and up over time. Don't got 'em? Don't stress. This deck doesn't mind a Soul's Majesty and a Garruk, which also draw cards equal to the power of our creatures and are perfectly fine. Admittedly, the Soul's Majesty does non-bow with the Dense Foliage I mentioned earlier, but then again, if we've got one untouchable, amazing creature in play, we're probably doing pretty well and hitting people pretty hard at that point anyway. It's worth the risk for us to keep our hand well stocked. The other 2 draw spells I'm suggesting here are in a similar vein, though they don't target, they just sacrifice. To stay in line with the greater good in the list already, I recommend Life's Legacy and Momentous Fall. Big creatures go smash, and then as it lays its head to rest, we'll draw upwards of 12 cards, and among those many new cards will probably be even more beefy creatures to slam down next turn. One dead creature is totally worth it if it means we get to draw that many cards. Oh, and one of the easiest budget swaps to make here is that Birds of Paradise can be just a regular old mana dork. We don't need a $10 card to fill this slot. I mentioned the combo of Savage Mintma and Aggravated Assault earlier too, but did y'all know that Aggravated Assault is like $20? That's a lot for just one combo. If you don't have the Assault, don't fret about it, and don't fret about including Ventma either. I'm gonna make a pretty funky swap out for these that I was dubious about at first, but I fell in love with more and more as I got to try them out. Blood Mist and, of all things, Haunted Cloak. Blood Mist is an obvious means of doubling up our creatures even more without having to spend any extra mana to make it happen each turn. Don't be afraid to try out Berserker's Onslaught in its place if you prefer the global version of this effect. With our trample enablers, this gets very scary, and I like that it can even come down on the turn before we cast Xenagos. As for the cloak, Vigilance is really good with our beefy creatures, and a repeatable source of trample is always a welcome sight. This equipment really impresses me, especially for just a 1 mana equip cost. The average deck also has one of those $10 heroic interventions. This is nice to blank an enemy spell when they try to take out our board, but you know what also sounds nice to help with that and costs less than a fifth of that price? A red counter spell. Tybalt's Trickery is silly. Who says blue mages get to have all the fun? This type of interaction from a beatdown deck can really catch opponents off guard. Lastly, there are 3 expensive creatures I'll make quick recommendations for. Balefire Dragon, Pathbreaker, and Elder Gargaroth combined to be over $60. That's not necessary, don't worry about them if you don't got them. Budget beaters are still beaters. I'm first changing out the Gargaroth for a Realm Seekers. It doesn't look it, but this thing can get frighteningly big, especially against the card advantage engine commanders running around in the format these days. I routinely see this thing being a 15-15 minimum. The biggest sin is that it doesn't have evasion, but when the body is that big, it gives us a lot to work with. As for the dragon, what say you to a Molten Primordial instead? All your stuff is belong to Xenagos. This is especially hilarious if we have a greater good in play and can sacrifice the creatures that we steal. The reality is that sometimes we don't have the very biggest creature in play. So if that's the case, we can just take it and double it up with Xenagos, and in the process, eliminate some blockers across the board by inviting them over. Sorry opponents, but as it turns out, they just like the party at our place better. For the final ad, here's a card that I think will surprise opponents with how big it can turn out to be. Wilderness Elemental. It's only 3 mana, it tramples, and it doesn't look like much, but it does some serious damage. In my experience, this thing is usually a minimum of 9 power, but I've also seen it come down as a 21 power creature before. Even if it arrives late, it's the life of the party. We're all done with the budget version of this deck, but real quick, let's circle back to the honorable mentions for players who liked the first deck list and want to optimize it even more. We'll call these the party favors. When tuning up the deck, these 3 creatures are the ones that I think Xenagos players might grow out of as they optimize even further. First is Jeska's Will. This thing's great. It's card advantage, and it's a ramp effect, and our commander will nearly always be in play. In fact, I pretty highly recommend any cards that rely upon having your commander in play to get bonuses, because Xenagos is an indestructible enchantment, and he rarely is going anywhere else. The final 2 come as a pair. Y'all seen Embercleave do things? Cause it does some seriously gross things, especially when brought about by Godo. Let's real quick walk through what happens when we cast Godo in this Xenagos deck. Godo fetches Embercleave and puts it onto the battlefield. Embercleave's trigger attaches itself to the Godo. Xenagos then pumps the Godo, doubling it to an 8/8 with trample and double strike. Godo's attack trigger untaps itself and gives us another combat step. So then, in that combat, Godo goes to a 16/16 with trample and double strike. That is a total of 48 damage across 2 attack steps. With trample! And it could happen as early as turn 6. I'll leave you to think about how insane that interaction is, while also leaving you here with our final budget version of the Xenagos deck list. Over $200 saved. Remember that both versions of the deck can be found in the description below with their respective cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed Xenagos' soiree, and if you have any other recommendations that you'd like to make for your fellow revelers, make sure you leave those suggestions in the comments below. And hey, now that the after party is over, are you going to the after party? Thanks so much for watching.